I saw the Green Goblin's dick in this movie. I only have one thing to say to that.
Impressive!
I love you. This isn't love. She asked me to fuck her in my uniform, then it hit me hard.
Kinds of Kindness comes to us from Oscar-nominated writer and director Yorgos Lanthimos and reunites some of the stars of his recent Oscar-winning film Poor Things. And in this movie, we follow a man without choice who tries to take control of his own life, a policeman who is alarmed that his wife who was missing at sea has returned and seems a different person, and a woman is determined to find a specific someone with a special ability who is destined to become a spiritual leader. So you're probably wondering, why am I now just reviewing this movie despite it being out for a few weeks already? Well, in my defense, none of my local theaters got it until this past weekend, and I saw it on Friday with a friend of mine, and the other reason is, man, this is a movie that I need to just sit on for a little bit, because for me personally, it's not one that I can have an opinion on right away. So if you're curious as to if I'm a fan of Yorgos Lanthimos' films, I've only seen the one, that being Poor Things, and I loved that movie, so of course I was kind of looking forward to this one. But just like the trailers to Poor Things, the trailers to this movie also don't really show you what it's about, so me and my friend both kind of went in blind, except for the fact that I knew that this was an anthology movie where the film is told in usually 3 different stories. But when it comes to Yorgos Lanthimos' films, you are really into his weird and absurd style and his dark sense of humor, or you're really turned off by it. As for me, as I've already said, I've only seen 2 of his films so far, so I can't really be the best judge on him, even though I think besides Poor Things and this, he only has like 2 other movies. But the other thing I knew about going into this movie was that this was getting the most divisive of reactions from people. Again, people either really love this movie or they really hate it, to the point where it's one of the worst movies of the year so far. So after sitting through the entire 2-hour and 44-minute runtime of Kinds of Kindness, where do I stand? Well, surprisingly, I really like this movie. I don't love it, but I can also see why people really aren't getting into it. I think the main group of people who are gonna get into this movie are fans of Yorgos' other works, because this is a very Yorgos movie, and it's also a movie where you can tell that the studio gave him a crap ton of money to make this movie, and they told him to do whatever the hell he wants, because that really shows in some areas. There are so many times where something weird or gross happens that's just there for the sake of being weird and gross, and usually, I don't like those kinds of movies where they do it all on purpose. But there are some aspects to this movie that actually really make it work. All the acting here was just great. With it being an anthology film compiled of 3 totally different stories, all the actors had to play 3 separate roles, and they nailed them perfectly. Anytime Jesse Plemons shows up in a movie, I know he's gonna do great, and he was the standout in every one of these stories. Probably my favorite performance from him in the film is in the first story, where he plays a man who takes very out there commands from his boss, played by Willem Dafoe. This is also the one where he gets to be the most comical, and he has some pretty funny bits. I especially love this one bit where he seems to be a collector of broken items from sports stars, so like a broken tennis racket is very valuable to him. And when it comes to that first story, I usually hate to say that the first story was my favorite, but honestly, it was. I can't say that was the one that had me the most intrigued, but I found it to be the most entertaining. It was the funniest in that kind of Yorgos Lanthimos' dark sense of humor way, and again, it had some of the best performances in the movie. Now when it comes to the second story, it was definitely the one that had me the most intrigued, because it's a great mystery about this man whose missing wife just returns out of nowhere. You first start to think it's the wife that's going crazy, because she's apparently not acting like herself, but you really start to question if the husband is the crazy one, because he starts doing weird shit like sucking a guy's bleeding hand and asking his wife to cut off her finger and serve it to him. Yes, that actually happens. It's that kind of movie, and again, I can very much see why someone would not get into this. There's also one part during the story where Emma Stone starts explaining this weird-ass dream that she had involving dogs, and for the life of me, I cannot tell if it was supposed to be taken seriously or not. Probably not, but it was just Willem Dafoe's look on his face while she was telling the story, and I was like, I cannot help but smirk at how seriously he is taking this. Now as for the last story, it was probably the weakest out of the 3. I thought it was good, but it wasn't great, and some of it was kind of confusing. But again, just like the last 2 stories, and this goes for them as well, the acting was great, they're all shot very well. I mean, the camera work in this movie is just great, and it's one of my favorite performances from Emma Stone in the movie. Even though in this story she hurts a puppy, and with the way this movie was going, I wouldn't have been shocked if she just snapped that dog's neck. Oh yeah, and the story has to do with like sex cults and a spiritual leader and all that weird stuff. Also, did anyone else find it kind of creepy that Willem Dafoe and Emma Stone made out in this movie, and in Poor Things they were basically father and daughter? Ew. As for things I liked, the directing was great, and I really do want to see more crazy and absurd movies from this director. I said this already, but the cinematography is great, and despite being over 2 hours and 44 minutes long, I didn't really feel the runtime. Okay, I can't say that the pacing was the greatest, but I'm guessing that one thing that really made it fly by was the fact that we were watching 3 totally different stories, and when one was over, I already knew we were halfway through the film. I also did like that when one story would end, they would all have end credits at the end of them, and they would have some like weird imagery going on in the background. And I do gotta appreciate that a company like Fox Searchlight would release a movie like this, because this really feels like something more geared towards like a company like A24 or Neon. As for stuff I didn't like, I did mention that this feels like a movie where the studio gave the director money to do whatever the hell he wanted, and I'm kind of mixed on that here. I love Yorgos Lanthimos' style, directing, dark sense of humor, and there are some weird moments in this movie that I can get behind, and some have a funny outcome, like a scene involving a certain video, but then there are moments that have no reason to them besides the fact that they're weird. And when it comes to these 3 stories, they're all really good and I was invested, but this isn't anything like Pulp Fiction where all the stories connect in the end. It honestly feels like Yorgos Lanthimos didn't want to make an anthology film, but he wanted to make 3 short films, but he couldn't really do anything with them besides making an anthology film. This movie honestly made me think of something like Beau's Afraid, because that movie was basically in the same scenario as Kinds of Kindness, where the studio gave the director a shit ton of money to do whatever he wanted. Except with Kinds of Kindness, it was an anthology with 3 different stories, so it didn't drag like Beau's Afraid. Also, Kinds of Kindness is a much better movie than Beau's Afraid. Fight me. And I guess the movie didn't need to be as long as it was, because there were aspects that could have been cut out here and there to shorten these stories. I also find it weird that out of all this guy's films, that this is the one that is the most mainstream, because when you actually watch it, it very much isn't. But in the end, I'm one of those people who really enjoyed Kinds of Kindness. But I think fans of Yorgos Lanthimos' films will be very split on this one. My recommendation for this is a confusing one, and that's because I'm telling you to proceed with caution. If you've seen this director's other movies, you know exactly what you're getting into, but if you've never seen one of his films, I'd start with like The Favorite or Poor Things first to get an idea of what his movies are like. But if you really hated this movie to the point where you cannot stand it, I fully understand. Yorgos Lanthimos' films don't seem to be for everybody, but after this and Poor Things, I'm excited to see what this director does next, no matter how weird and absurd it is. I'm gonna give Kinds of Kindness a B. Oh, and if you're wondering what my friend thought of the movie, she really liked it. I think even more than I did. But also, once the movie was over, I was looking at her like, oh, please tell me she liked it. Please tell me she liked it. Because, again, this is not a movie for everybody. I gotta make that very perfectly clear. You might like this movie, you might really hate it. Thanks so much for watching, you guys. Subscribe to my channel, like this video, turn the notification bell, and I'll be back later with more reviews. See you then.
We didn't, obviously, fuck.